I'm actually an engineer by trade originally. I did my mechanical engineering master's in London and quickly transitioned into trading because I realized I'm not one for a quiet work environment. So I joined an investment bank in London. I was I was the guy on the trading floor with the 2 phones and the 8 screens and just got a buzz from the trading floor. So I did that for a few years in London and then decided to go and do my MBA. So I went to Oxford to go do my MBA in 2017. And then after doing that, I had a really, really good time at Oxford. I absolutely loved it. And it was one of the key sort of formative experiences in my life that I absolutely adored. And so since then, what I've started doing is helping people get into MBA programs. I'm an admissions consultant. And so what that effectively means is it's a handful of separate tasks. One of them is getting to know people and learning about their profile in a way that I'm peeling away layers of an onion, getting to know them as individuals so that I can figure out what it is that we should include in their application, what it is about them that we should include in their application, what it is that we should leave out. So often this means, that in a way you're acting like a shrink. You're asking really probing questions and really trying to get at what it is that makes somebody tick. And it can be quite a deep process that we go into. So an element of what I do is asking questions. The other part is on the writing side. Now you're a writer, you will understand the power of strong storytelling. And so once we've got these stories, the next big part of what I do is taking the stories and putting them into a format that fits the MBA essay application format. So we've got word counts to worry about. Everything's got to be grammatically absolutely perfect, but also it's got to get that flair. So when people write, when I'm editing, it's a balance between editing out their work and making it pure, or leaving in that essence that makes them individuals. So there's an essay component to it. And then lastly, the bit that I personally really get buzzes from, really enjoy, is the interview side. And so a large part of what I do is actually preparing MBA candidates for their interviews. An MBA interview is not the same as a job interview. And quickly candidates I'm working with they really quickly realize that. And so a big part of what I do is doing interviews not dissimilar to this with people, getting them prepared for a MBA admissions interview. And so it's a fascinating world to be in. Backstory here is that I took my applications really, really seriously. So I flew to the US, I did a tour of the East Coast, I visited Yale, I visited Harvard, I visited MIT, I visited the East Coast schools. Then I flew over to Chicago and visited Kellogg and Booth in Chicago. And then I came to Europe and visited a handful of schools in Europe. This is all to realize that I wanted to go to Oxford. The point is, I met admissions staff, I sat in on classes, I met alumni and people who were the current students who were showing me around, and I did my homework really, really thoroughly. So when I then graduated from Oxford, and I had a few people come to me and say, hey, you went to Oxford, can you help me with my application? What I realized was that not only did I have my Oxford experience to fall back on, I also had all this homework that I had done, this massive world tour of business schools that I'd done to fall back on and to be able to give people a really nice picture of what the business school and what the MBA program and environment looks like, helping them choose the right school, helping them make informed decisions, helping them do their own research. And so I had a few people come to me asking, hey, can you help me with your application? I helped them. They got in to the various schools that they were applying to. And I realized that I was pretty good at what I was doing. I wasn't getting paid for it at the time, but I'm obviously doing something right. And then the numbers just got too big. I just had too many people asking for my help that I thought, you know what, it's time to start charging people for this. And so I became a professional admissions consultant, and I haven't looked back ever since. Admissions consulting is an interesting role because there is this perception that admissions consultants are somehow giving candidates an unfair advantage, right? There is this idea that, you know, you're paying for help, you're getting some sort of unfair advantage over other people. That's the stereotype. The thing is, every single person who's applying to an MBA gets help, right? You'd be an idiot not to, right? Whether it's asking your parents to proofread your essays, whether it's doing a mock interview with a colleague who's perhaps works in HR, who's good at interviewing. The point is, everybody gets help, right? What about if you haven't got, for example, a family that went to university? Where do you turn to? What if you're an entrepreneur and you haven't got colleagues around you who can do mock interviews with you? Where do you turn? And this is where admissions consultants come in. This is where my experience comes in. I consider what I do a leveler of the playing field in a sense, because anybody who, if they're looking at an MBA and they're looking at sinking costs into the cost of an MBA, they can afford what I'm offering. If they don't have the network around them already, then I provide a way that they can get really good preparation for the MBA application process that anybody can access. And so it's really it's really quite an interesting position to be in. The first thing, filtering what should be or what shouldn't be in an application. Admission staff are looking for the whole you. They're looking for a holistic image of the applicant. That's what they talk about. Does that mean you should talk about that time when you got caught behind the bike sheds at school? No. Does that mean that you should include, you know, your international experience, even though it wasn't in the work environment? Maybe you went backpacking. Probably yes. So the business school wants to know the entire applicant, but there is an element here of filtering out what an applicant should include. And clearly, based on my experience at business school myself and visiting all these schools, I have a fairly good idea of what they're looking for. So I help candidates say the right thing. The other thing is, okay, we've figured out what it is you want to tell the business school. Now, how do you say it? Most MBA applicants have been working for, say, 4, 5, 6, maybe more years. It might have been quite a long time since they actually wrote an essay, especially a story, which is the form that the MBA applications really, if you can, want to take. So I help them take their experience and transform it into a story. And then, as I mentioned, interview coaching. Interviews for MBAs are not the same as a job interview. And one of the key mistakes that applicants make when they go into the process is they think, oh, I've interviewed for a couple of jobs in the last couple of years, I moved roles, I'll be fine. And then the questions that they get asked are simply not what they are expecting, because these are not industry professionals who are interviewing MBA applicants. They may, a lot of what they've, if they come into the application throwing out technical terms in their CV, the interviewer might not have a clue what they've talked about in the CV in some of the professional roles. So an MBA interview is really not the same as the interviews that you've prepared for. So a big part of what an MBA admissions consultant does is peppering an interviewee with the right type of questions, so that when the time comes, they don't throw out the opportunity. Generally, as a rule of thumb, once you get through the essay writing process and you get offered an interview, your chances are about 50-50. So you're really, really close. And a Zoom interview with questions that you can probably prepare, it'd be a real shame if that's what keeps you out of your dream business school. So I make sure applicants don't fall on those hurdles that keep coming up. often applicants have an idea of where they want to apply, both in terms of the kind of they've looked at the rankings and they've thought, yeah, I'd like to target this particular area. Often in terms of geography, there's certain a US MBA is something that a lot of people have set their hearts on. So where I step in is taking their ambition, but also adding a layer of pragmatism to it. So what I mean by that is there are some subtleties to the MBA application process that people don't initially expect. For example, US business schools tend to have longer courses, so typically a 2-year course, which enables applicants to spend a bit more time, doing longer internships, doing career treks, and generally sort of feeling out jobs that they might find attractive. It therefore means that US applicants tend to be a bit younger. On the other hand, European schools tend to be 1 year. They tend to favor applicants who know what it is they want to do post MBA, and therefore tend to favor applicants with more work experience. So if I have an applicant come to me with 8 years work experience and say, I'm determined to go to these particular schools, and they all happen to be US schools, part of my role is saying, let's think about this objectively. You are at the top end of the work experience range. Should you perhaps consider the European schools, purely from a maximizing your probability of getting in perspective? And sometimes applicants will turn around and say, no, absolutely not. I'm head set on the US, in which case, fair play, we'll get started. But a lot of the time there is a discussion to be had. And then, how this might look is, okay, yes, you've got a little bit more work experience. Maybe you should look at Europe. They say, oh, I'm open to that, but I hadn't really thought of schools. And then my experience comes into talking about the different European schools, the different cultures at these schools, and therefore helping the candidate think, okay, that school sounds good. I'll go away and do a little bit more research in my own time. And then they'll come back to me and say, right, Sam, how does this sound? Oxford, Cambridge, LBS, for example. And I'll say, yeah, that sounds great. That really fits your profile. Here are the essay questions. Let's go. It's an interesting one. On the one hand, COVID has made the application process more difficult for several reasons. Business schools are more competitive. The one that everybody talks about that is quite well telegraphed is the idea that as an economy suffers and more people get made redundant, lose their jobs, they think, what should I do? And maybe there's a great job waiting for them, but maybe there isn't. And they think, you know what? An MBA would be a really nice alternative option to go and spend the time reevaluating, potentially change career, buy myself a little bit of time. Hopefully the job market improves. And so when the economy falls and particularly unemployment rises, you tend to get a pickup in applications. And COVID has been no different. Applications for the big schools are up everywhere. So US up, Europe up. Now, I've heard numbers between 35 and 50% increases in terms of the number of applicants for this year's round versus last year's round, for example. So the numbers are up. And of course, if there's more numbers, there's more applicants, it's harder. And if it's harder, there is a tendency for people to say, okay, it's even more difficult than years gone by. I'm going to reach out and get some help. And so this year has been extremely busy in terms of work. So that's the one side. The other element of it, which is a little bit more subtle and people don't talk about, is this idea that there are more applicants in this round who have been deferring their entry into next year because they don't want to do an online MBA, because they don't feel safe traveling, because they don't want to leave their parents, whatever it may be. They have decided, they've already received an acceptance letter last year, and they've decided, I'm going to defer my application. And what does that mean? That means there's even less spots available for even more applicants. So again, that builds the competitivity element. And that, again, means more people coming to me for help. Another thing, smaller classes. One of the measures that a lot of business schools are taking to ensure that they can have in-person classes next year is they're committing to smaller class sizes. Maybe it's one seat between every student in a lecture theatre, for example. And if there's smaller class sizes and they've already got a lot of applicants deferring, again, makes it more competitive. So from a macro sense, COVID has been very, very positive for admissions consultants in general. The first one is the GMAT/GRE hurdle, which every MBA applicant, or actually not anymore, but historically, every MBA applicant had to have a standardized test score, not only to demonstrate their intelligence, but also to demonstrate that they can tackle a mentally challenging process. Nowadays, a lot of business schools are actually waiving the GMAT, so it's less important. That said, I encourage applicants to apply with a GMAT if possible, because they should, if they're confident, their GMAT should provide them an opportunity to show off. And as an MBA applicant applying to top business schools, you want every opportunity you can to show off. So I guess tip one is, if you can take a GMAT/GRE exam, then do so, despite the waivers that are being offered by some schools at the moment. Another tip is, when you go through the application process, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, don't assume that the reader has intimate knowledge of your industry. Now, often the admissions staff have got experience in particular industries and are able to understand, for example, the acronyms that you're referring to in your application, but do not make that assumption.